Josh Hasten here in Jerusalem, the beautiful studios of Voice of Israel, downtown, right next to the old Central train station, rather. It is the 17th of September, 2014. Hope you're doing well in your part of the world. Don't forget, you can follow us here on Voice of Israel, on Facebook, Voice of Israel, or on Twitter at VO Israel. It's that simple. Follow us. Let us know what you think. We have so many wonderful programs here at the station, so many talented hosts that bring you information which you are not getting anywhere else. Speaking about information and accuracy, sitting with me in studio is the one and only Tamar Sternthal. She is the director of the Israel office for CAMERA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America. And I will acknowledge, I have had past affiliations with the organization. I was there. I had the distinct honor and privilege of being their letter writer of the year in 2009. And it really was my activity through the organization and through the updates I was getting from CAMERA, which allowed me to understand the reality of the situation here in Israel. So I'd like to thank you here in person and the rest of the staff back in Boston, because you definitely had an influence on my desire to want to come to Israel and get involved in journalism. So I'll thank you for that.
And thank you for training other letter writers who have been published elsewhere.
Thank you so much. Getting back to topic, the war in Gaza this past summer, 50 plus days, overall coverage from where you're sitting in the CAMERA office. How was the coverage of the war in terms of its accuracy, whether it was pro-Israel, anti-Israel, fair and balanced, as they say? And if you can, after that, which outlets did a good job and which ones did not receive passing marks in your view?
Hamas had a clear strategic goal to falsely depict this conflict as one between the Israeli army and the civilians of the Gaza Strip. And in actuality, it was a conflict between the terrorist organization of Hamas and Israel. And Hamas was, of course, targeting Israeli civilians. I think Hamas largely succeeded in their goal. And we saw this in a number of ways. First of all, reports which did speak of Hamas and talk about Israel was fighting Hamas buried the information that Hamas was a terrorist organization. Many of them, if they mention that it has been designated as a terrorist organization by the United States and Israel and the European Union, buried that information deep down into the story, where many readers don't bother to get that far. Furthermore, we know that Hamas told the Interior Ministry is run by Hamas, and they sent out a directive to local activists and to media personalities to conceal the fact that casualties were felt among the Hamas fighters, and that everyone should be depicted as an innocent civilian. And these were the images that we saw coming out of the war. I think you have to look no further than the photo gallery of the Los Angeles Times to understand that Hamas succeeded in this respect. We carried out an analysis of this photo gallery, which was carried out at the point where they had 77 pictures, and the LA Times kept adding pictures as the conflict was going. And this photo gallery could be accessed from any article about the conflict during the fighting. So many, many viewers and readers did see it. And when we looked at the gallery, there were 77 pictures. We checked back in a couple of days later, they were up to 99 pictures. There was not one photograph that depicted a Hamas fighter, either dead or alive. More than that, maybe it was difficult to photograph these fighters because they weren't identified necessarily as the fighters, and this was part of their strategy. There was not a single caption which mentioned Hamas, and there is no excuse for that. Furthermore, there was not a single photograph of any rockets that were coming out of the Gaza Strip, and those were easy to photograph. There were photographers all over Israel capturing these images. There were no images of the effect of the rocket, those that made it through the Iron Dome and hit property in Israel. And of course, Israeli civilians did suffer casualties, injuries, and the Israeli civilians were not a part of the story. The story in the eyes of the Los Angeles Times photo editor was devastation among Gaza civilians. So here Hamas succeeded in depicting a war against Gaza civilians. And this is what Nabil Shah said, that Israel was not carrying out a war against Hamas. Israel is carrying out a war against the civilians of Gaza. And he's not with Hamas. He's from the Palestinian Authority.
So in that case, then, would you say, in terms of the battle of ideas, information, Hamas, in fact, if you can, put it into a category of winners and losers, Hamas, you're saying, won that battle, the battle of narratives, the battle of opinions, based on your assessments?
In many places, yes. I can't say that the Los Angeles Times was all equally guilty of this problem. I think their news coverage, their actual articles, did a lot better on the score than their photo gallery, for instance. So it's very tricky to make blanket statements. We do acknowledge nuance and the fact that even in one media outlet, there could be a reporter who does acknowledge the fact that there were human shields that were a critical part of this conflict, and that was part of the Hamas strategy, and it could be ignored elsewhere in another aspect of the coverage.
I did see some lame excuses by various media outlets describing why they couldn't cover the story properly, why they failed to show the pictures of the Hamas terrorists and the rockets, etc. I believe, all kinds of crazy excuses. You probably heard them. What were some of those excuses, and how are
there
you
was a
combating those?
spokeswoman for the New York Times who was responding to, I think, a writer for the JTA who was looking into this issue, and she said, well, we photographed what we had access to. Bingo, that's exactly the point. They weren't given access. And if they're being blocked from coverage, if they're not given access, if they're being pressured or intimidated in any way, this needs to be said. Maybe not by the reporter who's sitting in the Gaza Strip, because that is actually dangerous for that reporter's life, but there are all kinds of workarounds that they can do to get this information out there so that readers are aware that they're not receiving the full picture and that their information that they're receiving is being filtered by Hamas.
One of the journalists who I did see, and apparently I didn't realize it at the time, but he actually reported after he left Gaza for his own safety, was the Indian journalist who was in a hotel, and he noticed some suspicious activity taking place, and lo and behold, it was a Hamas rocket crew getting ready to launch, and then several minutes before one of the 10, 11 ceasefires we have, they went ahead and launched, and he went back to India and reported that. That I guess is too far in between, as they say. This guy who was able to actually report on Hamas, too few and far in between. Is that the expression? Was actually able to report on Hamas and did his job.
I notice he's not from a major Western media outlet, right? He didn't, as Matthew Friedman wrote in his terrific article in Tablet magazine, which really gives a wonderful overview about all the problems in coverage of what's called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is one of the faults that he finds with the coverage, that it really is the conflict between Israel, or Jews, and the Arabs, that there's this intimidation.
Yeah, he actually sat in that chair right there on the Yishai Fleischer show here at Voice of Israel Radio, I believe last week, to talk about that very popular article. If you get a correction from any of the major media organizations, do you believe that does change opinions? I mean, there's this theory. There's a theory that once the picture is published, once the article is written, the story is over. That's it. They've gotten the victory, so to speak. When camera gets a correction from the New York Times or any of the other outlets, tell me, in your opinion, has the full damage already been done, or do you have hope that you're able to change minds as a result?
That's a very good question. And the impact of the corrections is not so much on the news consumers themselves. It's on the news outlet itself. It's an internal impact. And our goal is institutional change. And let me give you an example from the summer of 2000 from the most influential media outlet, which is the New York Times. 3 times in the summer of 2000, they misreported UN Resolution 242, which is the backbone of all Arab-Israeli negotiations since the 1967 war. And the resolution laid out that it called on Israel to withdraw from territories that it captured in the 1967 war. And the resolution specifically did not lay down and define which those territories are and to what extent. That was specifically left open for negotiations. Yet 3 times in the Camp David negotiations between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat and President Clinton, New York Times misreported, stating that UN resolution called for Israel to withdraw from the territories it seized in the 1967 war. And they even went on in some of the instances to say, including Eastern Jerusalem or the Old City. And of course, the resolution makes no mention of any particular locations or to what extent. So 3 times in the summer of 2000, July, August, and again in September, the New York Times was compelled to correct this error. And 14 years have passed. They have not repeated the error, and we have used this series of corrections to leverage corrections elsewhere, and we have improved the quality of coverage on this particular substantive issue across the board. So we have really elevated quality of coverage in a broad spectrum of places,
So
thanks to the corrections.
It's not about the consumer, it's about future reports and educating people in the future. In other words, once that article misinforms, it's almost as if that article is already done. Let's speak to the editors. Let's get the journalists on board in terms of the facts, so that they, in the future, when they write and they do, go ahead and write again, get it straight. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes, that, and also the fact that they will be aware of the fact that they are being held accountable, and they don't have the freedom to either be careless or to deliberately insert misinformation. They'll know that they will be held accountable and they will be forced to correct. And I think it's embarrassing when a journalist has to have a correction on their story, and they would rather not have to. And if they know that in order to avoid corrections, they have to report accurately, then that will be the result, better journalism. And I think that's to everyone's benefit.
I want to ask you a pretty broad question, if I can. And this is something that I've believed for many, many years, the power of words. Okay, and this is, as we say a lot, that there are two battles going on simultaneously when Israel's at war. There's a battle with tanks, and then there's a battle of stories, ideas, narratives, etc. Clarify or explain or expound, if you can, on what I've said on the air many times, that words can kill and words can save. They can kill or they can save lives. Expound on that statement, if you can.
I think just by the nature of the fact that we've seen a rise in attacks against Jews in Europe, I think it's not far-fetched to draw a direct line to not the events that happen in Gaza, but the coverage of the events that happen in Gaza. Again, by falsely depicting Israel is carrying out a war against civilians in Gaza has resulted in attacks against Jews. Coverage of events has life and death impact, and I'll give you two examples. There was a soldier during the beginning of the Second Intifada, Yosef Madhat, an Israeli Arab soldier who was he had been shot. I forget where the location was. He had been shot. He was bleeding to death in the field. And the Israeli commanders were in touch with their Palestinian counterparts, and they were asking for a halt to fire so that they could extract him safely from the field and save his life.
Yeah, in Shem, I believe.
Yes,
Nablus.
I believe you're correct. Yes. And the Palestinians refused. As a result, he was bleeding to death, and he died there. Later, it was reported in the Jerusalem Post that one of the commanders said, we could have brought in heavy weapons and saved his life, but imagine how that would look to the rest of the world. So as clearly a result of Israel being concerned about the media coverage, we know in that particular instance, a soldier did die.
It's heart-wrenching, really. It's heart-wrenching that, unfortunately, that has to be taken into consideration. You're talking about human lives, and the Israeli establishment, the government, et cetera, has to make that decision. It's extremely difficult. I want to focus now on, as we're almost out of time, I want to focus on one of the camera updates, and your organization does an amazing job of sending out updates on a weekly, I believe, basis, if not more. I think it's actually based on the articles, so it could be several times a week if there's
we try not to overwhelm people's inboxes.
But listen, if there's misinformation, it's very important, I understand, to get it out there. The last camera alert that I saw, and I could be off, I saw this morning, there was a conference at the UN on global anti-Semitism on September the 8th, and the question you were asking was, where was the coverage? So I'd like to know from you, what's the story here? The UN had a conference on the 8th of September, global anti-Semitism. There were some good speakers there, and it was ignored by the mainstream media all over the world. I didn't know anything about it until I saw your statements there.
Actually, I admit I haven't seen this particular post. We are a large organization, and I should have mentioned earlier, we're not only covering the American media, we have many affiliates. We have a Hebrew language affiliate called ProtectiveEdge, based here in Jerusalem, which covers the Hebrew language media. And the reason why we focus on that is because much of the misinformation that appears in foreign press originated here in Israel. We also have Spanish language media outlet, Revista, which covers Spanish language media from from Spain and the Americas, and we extensively cover the British media, both with our affiliated blogs SIF Watch and BBC Watch. So I apologize that I'm not up to date on that latest release, but I can talk to you about what were the two items that I posted this very morning,
Please.
which I think completely dovetail with Hamas's strategy of downplaying, of depicting Israel as being engaged in a war against Gaza's civilians, because that dovetails with the whole media theme of depicting the Palestinians as blameless victims, and that Israel is the only culpable party in this conflict. So, for instance, there was a headline this morning in New York Daily News regarding the mortar attack against Israel yesterday. A mortar fell in Israeli territory yesterday, and can you imagine what the photographs that would have run with that?
Probably,
headline?
But I'll let you go ahead.
Okay, so there were 4 photographs. There was one featured photograph right at the top of Israel, an airstrike in the Gaza Strip from August 26, and there were 3 additional photographs of debris or rubble in Gaza, and one of them was just from September 12th of a car pulling out of the zoo in northern Gaza. So I'm wondering, what is the news relevance to a mortar attack on Israel of a car pulling out of the zoo in the Gaza Strip? Okay, maybe it wasn't the most graphic incident to depict, maybe because the mortar attack didn't cause any damage, but Israel suffered 4,500 rocket and mortar attacks over the summer, and if they were going back into the summer to show us pictures and things that happened in the Gaza Strip, if we're talking about an attack on Israel, surely there could have been at least one photograph of an attack on Israel.
It's not surprising, but it's absolutely unacceptable. I mean, that's not the story. That's not what happened. It is, to put it in simple terms, it's a lie. That photo is a lie. It didn't happen yesterday. What happened yesterday was somebody violated the ceasefire that we have, fired a rocket, tried to kill Israelis, and they're not showing it.
Yeah, and there's the headline was very straightforward. It said it just like that, that mortar from Gaza violates Hamas ceasefire. Not those exact words, but that was the message. It was very straightforward. So here's an example where there are many different personalities involved in putting together a news report. Many editors and writers, and the photo editor and the journal and the writer who wrote the story. So there are different elements to look at, and here the headline was right on, and still the photo editor didn't get the story right.
Tamar Sternthal, I could talk to you all day. I really want to thank you for coming here into our studios here, Voice of Israel Radio. Your website, is that the best way for people to get in touch? Camera.org?
www.camera.org.
Thank you so much for all the important work that you do. I definitely want to speak to you as time goes on. We'd love to host you here again in the studio because, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like all of the news coverage is going to go our way anytime soon, and that's why your organization, CAMERA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, is so important. Tamar Sternthal, thank you so much for joining us here on the Josh Hasten Show, Voice of Israel Radio.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Josh.
And, dear listener, stay tuned. Much more to come on the second half of the show. Don't go anywhere. We are live in Jerusalem. Josh Hasten, Voice of Israel.